The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, trembling so hard he could barely form the words. Ladies and gentlemen, all airspace has just been indefinitely restricted. The authorities, they're forcing us to open the main cabin doors. My stomach plummeted to my feet. Through the rain-slicked window, I watched 20 black SUVs surround the aircraft like a pack of wolves. I clutched my stomach, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had wiped my hard drives. I paid in cash. I was invisible. But as the heavy pneumatic door hissed open, allowing the freezing rain and the terrifying, intoxicating scent of smoked cedar and gunpowder into the cabin, I realized the horrifying truth. You cannot hide from a man who owns the shadows. Choi Sang-do stepped onto the plane, his perfectly tailored suit damp with rain, a silenced pistol resting casually in his right hand. His lethal, dead-eyed gaze scanned the terrified passengers until he locked onto me. Did you really think? His deep, vibrating voice echoed through the silent cabin. I would let you board that plane? Before we find out what this ruthless syndicate king does to the woman who tried to steal his unborn heir, hit that subscribe button to join Mimi's Afro-Korean Diary. If you crave unhinged, possessive men who will shut down an entire city just to keep the woman they claim, you won't want to miss Chapter 1. Let's dive in. I pressed my spine hard against the leather seat, trying to put even an inch of distance between us as he stalked down the aisle. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, ignoring the gasps of the flight attendants. When he stopped beside my row, the sheer size of his frame blocked out the emergency lights. I paid off the debt, I whispered, refusing to break eye contact even as my hands shook. We had a deal, Sang-do. I am a free woman. A dark, wicked smile touched the corner of his lips, but it lacked any real warmth. He leaned down, bracing his large, calloused hand on the armrest, trapping me completely. The blistering heat radiating off him seeped right through my silk blouse. You broke the deal the second you decided to pack my heir into a carry-on, he murmured, his face hovering mere inches from mine. Did you honestly believe I would let my bloodline be born in another time zone? Before I could argue, his free hand shot out, wrapping securely around my waist. He hauled me out of the seat effortlessly, lifting me tight against his solid chest. The entire cabin watched in frozen horror as the syndicate king marched me back toward the open exit. I struggled, pushing against his broad shoulders, but his grip was an iron cage. Put me down, I hissed, kicking my heels. I have a non-refundable ticket. I just bought the airline, he stated flatly, his jaw locked as he carried me onto the dimly lit jet bridge. You are going home. He didn't get to finish the threat. A deafening crack ruptured the air. The massive glass pane of the jet bridge exploded inward, raining jagged crystal all around us as a high-caliber sniper bullet tore through the space exactly where my head had just been. The explosive crack of the sniper rifle was still ringing in my ears when total darkness eclipsed my vision. Before the worst of the blast could hit my face, Sang-do took me to the floor. His massive frame covered me entirely, pressing my cheek against the damp, charcoal fabric of his suit. The freezing rain ripped through the shattered window, but all I could focus on was the terrifying, steady thud of his heartbeat against my chest. He didn't flinch. He didn't even brace for impact. He simply turned himself into a human shield. Stay exactly where you are, he ordered. The vibration of his deep voice rumbled against my collarbone. He shifted his weight just enough to draw his weapon, his lethal gaze snapping toward the distant terminal roof. Ho-jin's dogs. They are getting bold. Another volley of gunfire tore through the metal siding of the jet bridge. Sparks rained down like violent confetti. We can't stay here, I choked out, the reality of the ambush finally suffocating my lungs. I am aware, he replied with chilling calm. His hand clamped securely onto the back of my thigh, hauling me upright in one fluid motion while keeping my head tucked firmly under his broad shoulder. Do not let go of my jacket. He didn't lead us back onto the aircraft. Instead, he kicked open the heavy steel service door leading down to the tarmac. The freezing wind whipped my loose hair wildly as we spilled out onto the exposed exterior stairs. Automatic fire pinged against the metal railing inches from our feet. My expensive travel heels slipped on the wet grating, my knee buckling. Before I could fall, Sang-do scooped me entirely off my feet. He carried me against his chest with terrifying ease, taking the slick metal steps 2 at a time while returning fire into the storm with his free hand. He was an apex predator, moving flawlessly through the chaos. I can run! I yelled over the deafening roar of the wind. You are carrying my child, Tina, he fired back smoothly, his jaw locked tight as a bullet ricocheted off the stairwell. You will not run a single step on a wet tarmac. He breached the gaping concrete mouth of the underground baggage handling zone, plunging us into the dim, cavernous belly of the airport. He set me down gently behind a massive steel luggage carousel, out of the line of fire. The distant echoes of his men engaging the hit squad faded into the background. He ejected the spent magazine of his pistol, his dark, calculating eyes immediately dropping from a fresh, bleeding graze on his own cheek directly to my hands, which were fiercely guarding my stomach. The war outside was raging, but in the heavy shadows of the baggage claim, the quiet tension between us suddenly became the most dangerous thing in the room. The distant crackle of gunfire echoed through the cavernous baggage claim, but Sang-do didn't wait to see if his men were winning. His grip remained firm on my waist as he guided me away from the steel carousels, pushing open a heavy, unmarked door. We spilled into a narrow, unlit maintenance corridor. The air inside smelled of stale dust and industrial floor wax, immediately overpowered by the heavy, intoxicating scent of his smoked cedar cologne. He closed the door silently, plunging us into near absolute darkness. The only light bled through a rusted ventilation grate near the ceiling, casting pale, striped shadows across his sharp jaw. The frantic rush of adrenaline suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence. He backed me up until my shoulders touched the cool cinder block wall. He didn't step away. He stayed entirely in my personal space, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, calculated rhythm. He lifted his hand, bracing his palm flat against the concrete beside my head, caging me in. His dark, calculating gaze dropped to my stomach, lingering there for a long, agonizing second before slowly rising back to meet my eyes. 6 weeks, he stated. It wasn't a question. The low vibration of his voice commanded the tiny space. You found out yesterday morning. You withdrew the last of your savings by noon and booked a flight under a forged surname by midnight. My pulse hammered frantically against my ribs. You track my medical records? I track everything that belongs to me, Tina. He tilted his head, the faint light catching the fresh streak of blood on his cheek. Why did you run? Because I know how your world works, I shot back, keeping my voice to a harsh whisper. I pressed my hands flat against his damp suit jacket, trying to push him back, but he was an immovable stone wall. I was just collateral to you, Sang-do. A debt collection. Heirs are vulnerabilities in your syndicate. I knew exactly what you would force me to do the second you decided a baby was a liability to your empire. For the first time since I had met him, Choi Sang-do went entirely still. The cold, ruthless apex predator vanished. A raw, terrifying intensity flared in his dark eyes. His large, calloused hand left the wall, his long fingers tangling deeply into the loose hair at the nape of my neck. He stepped flush against me, his thumb brushing over my jawline with a staggering, reverent gentleness that short-circuited my brain. "Destroy my own blood?" he whispered fiercely, his face hovering a fraction of an inch from mine. "I would burn this entire city to ash before I let anyone harm a single hair on your head. You are my queen. And this child?" He didn't get to finish the vow. The heavy steel door we had just locked violently burst off its hinges, crashing deafeningly against the concrete floor. The heavy steel door didn't just open, it crumpled inward with a deafening metallic screech. A thick cloud of pulverized concrete flooded the narrow corridor, followed instantly by the massive, heavily armed silhouette of a mercenary stepping through the debris. Before I could even scream, Sang-do moved. He didn't hesitate or brace himself. He simply shifted his weight, shielding me completely with his broad shoulders, while his right hand leveled his weapon. Two suppressed shots cracked through the heavy, dust-filled air. The silhouette dropped to the floor without a sound. "Move," Sang-do commanded. He didn't give me a fraction of a second to process the violence. His large hand clamped securely around my wrist, pulling me over the shattered doorframe and out into the blinding floodlights of the airport's exterior loading dock. The freezing rain was still falling in sheets. Waiting at the bottom of the concrete ramp was a convoy of heavy, armored SUVs. Men in tailored suits were crouched behind the open doors, returning fire toward the upper concourse and laying down a relentless shield of cover. Sang-do didn't slow his stride. He hauled me toward the center vehicle, throwing open the heavy rear door and pushing me into the spacious leather interior. He climbed in right behind me, slamming the reinforced door shut just as a fresh barrage of gunfire rained against the exterior. The thick, bullet-resistant glass beside my head merely spiderwebbed under the violent impact. "Drive," he ordered the man behind the wheel. The massive engine let out a guttural roar, and the heavy vehicle fishtailed violently as it launched onto the slick, wet tarmac. I was thrown sideways by the sudden, aggressive acceleration. Instantly, Sang-do's arm banded tightly around my waist. He pulled me seamlessly against his damp charcoal suit, anchoring my trembling frame to his solid chest as the SUV tore down the active runway at well over 100 miles an hour. Through the fractured glass, I watched 3 rogue vehicles smash through a perimeter chain-link fence, their high beams slicing through the storm as they swerved onto the runway in aggressive pursuit. "They're right behind us," I gasped, my fingers digging desperately into the lapels of his jacket. "They are exactly where I want them," he replied, his tone entirely smooth. His heartbeat was infuriatingly calm, a steady, rhythmic thud beneath my palms. He reached up, tapping the communication device secured in his ear. "Bravo team, you have the green light. Clear the runway." A split second later, the night sky completely lit up. A blinding explosion erupted on the tarmac far behind us, sending a massive shockwave that rattled our heavy chassis. I squeezed my eyes shut, instinctively burying my face deep into the crook of his neck. The fierce, protective pressure of his grip tightened around me. He pressed his lips firmly against the crown of my head, entirely unbothered by the blazing wreckage fading in our rearview mirror. "I told you, Tina." His deep, vibrating hum resonated straight through my bones as we sped off the runway and into the dark, sleeping city. "No one touches what is mine." The private elevator chimed, a soft, civilized sound that felt entirely out of place after the violence on the runway. The steel doors glided open, revealing the cavernous expanse of Sang-do's penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass wrapped around the entire living space, offering a sweeping view of the storm-drenched city below. Yet the inside was wrapped in absolute, suffocating silence. The chaos of the world simply wasn't allowed up here. I stepped onto the cold marble floor, my legs suddenly trembling violently as the adrenaline finally crashed. I wrapped my arms around my waist, clutching the damp silk of my blouse. Sang-do walked past me, casually shrugging off his ruined suit jacket and tossing it over a custom leather chair. He unfastened his shoulder holster, laying the heavy weapon on the dark stone island with a terrifyingly casual thud. "You will take the master suite," he stated, his back still turned as he rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, exposing the intricate ink wrapping around his thick forearms. "And you will not step foot outside of it without my permission." "I am not a prisoner," I argued, though my voice lacked its usual fire. My bones ached with exhaustion. He turned around, his sharp gaze instantly dropping to my left foot. I hadn't even noticed the stinging pain until he looked at it. A jagged piece of crystal from the jet bridge had sliced through the skin just above my heel, leaving a thin trail of crimson staining my shoe. In a fraction of a second, the cold, authoritative syndicate king vanished. He crossed the vast room, his large hands gripping my waist as he lifted me effortlessly, setting me down on the edge of a plush velvet sofa. I braced myself for a harsh lecture, but instead, Choi Sang-do dropped to one knee on the hard marble floor. He didn't summon a medic. He retrieved a small silver case from a nearby drawer and returned to his place at my feet. With agonizing care, his long, calloused fingers unclasped my ruined heel, tossing it aside. He soaked a clean cloth in antiseptic. "This will sting," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated straight through the quiet room. I flinched as the damp cloth touched my skin, but his free hand immediately anchored my calf. His grip was an iron vice, yet his thumb stroked the side of my leg with a staggering, reverent gentleness. He cleaned the tiny wound as if he were handling priceless porcelain. "You killed men tonight," I whispered, staring down at his broad shoulders, trying to reconcile the ruthless predator on the tarmac with the man currently bandaging my foot. He secured the bandage, his calculating eyes lifting slowly to meet mine. He didn't deny it. He simply let his thumb rest over the racing pulse point at my ankle. "I am a monster to the rest of the world, Tina," he replied, his tone devoid of any regret. "But I will only ever be a shield for you." The heavy rain had finally stopped, replaced by the quiet, sterile hum of the penthouse climate control. I woke up alone in the center of an impossibly massive bed, tangled in dark silk sheets. My bandaged foot throbbed faintly, a sharp reminder that the violent chaos on the tarmac hadn't been a nightmare. I slipped out from under the covers. The emerald blouse and trousers from yesterday were gone, replaced at some point in the night by one of Sang-do's oversized, soft cotton dress shirts. It swallowed my frame and smelled entirely of him, smoked cedar and a faint trace of danger. I needed to know how much of my erased identity was compromised. Limping slightly, I pushed open the heavy oak doors leading to his adjoining private study. The room was empty, but a sleek tablet lay illuminated on the sprawling glass desk. I shouldn't have looked, but my forged surname was glowing in bright red text across the screen. I tapped the glass, pulling up the file. It wasn't just my flight manifest. It was an intercepted, encrypted communication thread. Attached to a copy of my boarding pass was a single line of text. "She's carrying his bloodline. Terminal 4, wire the money." My blood ran completely cold. I recognized the encrypted sender alias instantly. Desmond, my ex-boyfriend. The man whose reckless gambling debts had forced me into Sang-do's orbit as collateral 6 months ago. Desmond hadn't just tracked me down, he had sold my location and the secret of my pregnancy directly to Baek Jin's rival syndicate. He asked them for $2 million. A deep, vibrating voice echoed from the doorway. I spun around, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. Sang-do stood perfectly still in the archway. He was dressed in a fresh, tailored dark dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his tattooed forearms. His expression was a terrifying, unreadable void. "Desmond sold me," I whispered, the sheer weight of the betrayal making it hard to breathe. "He told them about the baby." Sang-do walked slowly into the study, closing the distance between us with that fluid, predatory grace. He stepped directly into my space, his towering frame completely eclipsing the morning light filtering through the windows. His large, warm hands settled heavily onto my shoulders, his grip instantly grounding my trembling body. "Ho-jin's men were already waiting at your departure gate," Sang-do murmured, his thumbs brushing a slow, anchoring rhythm against my collarbones. "If you had boarded that flight, you never would have landed in London." I stared up at him, the horrifying reality finally setting in. "I didn't just ground the planes to keep you from leaving, Tina." His voice dropped to a low, lethal hum. "I shut down the airspace because it was the only way to reach you before they did." He tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his dark, ruthless eyes. "And now, you are going to watch exactly what happens to a man who tries to sell my family." Before the echo of his lethal promise could fade, the heavy double doors of the study swung open. Two of Sang-do's massive guards dragged a thrashing, bruised figure across the polished hardwood, throwing him violently onto his knees. It was Desmond. He looked pathetic, his designer jacket torn and ruined from being dragged across the wet tarmac. The man who had gambled away our savings and originally left me as collateral to a syndicate was now trembling violently under the cold, indifferent stare of the king. "Tina!" Desmond gasped, spitting blood onto the pristine floor. "Tell them to let me go! I didn't know Ho-jin's men were going to ambush the airport, I swear! I just needed the cash to clear my markers." I took a step back, sheer disgust twisting my stomach. Sang-do didn't raise his voice. He didn't even draw a weapon. He simply reached over, his large hand wrapping securely around my waist, pulling my back flush against his solid chest. He anchored me there, his heat bleeding through the thin cotton of my oversized shirt, forcing me to look down at the man groveling on the floor. 2 million, Sang-do repeated, the low, vibrating timbre of his voice dropping the temperature in the room. "You placed a $2 million price tag on my bloodline, and you thought a forged passport could hide you from my reach?" "Please," Desmond begged, crawling forward a few inches. "We used to be together, Tina. We were family. You know I wouldn't—" "Do not speak her name," Sang-do interrupted smoothly. The air in the room grew suffocatingly dense. Sang-do released my waist, stepping slowly around the glass desk. Desmond scrambled backward, but the guards planted their boots firmly on his shoulders, pinning him to the hardwood. Sang-do crouched in front of him. The rolled-up sleeves of his navy shirt stretched tight against the thick muscles of his arms. He picked up a heavy, silver letter opener from the edge of the desk, turning it over in his long, calloused fingers with terrifying casualness. "She belonged to me the moment you left her at my casino," Sang-do murmured, his dark eyes locking onto Desmond's terrified face. "But selling her flight details to a rival cartel? That requires a permanent lesson." "Sang-do," I breathed, my hands trembling, not out of pity for Desmond, but from the sheer, raw violence radiating off the man I was carrying a child for. Sang-do looked over his broad shoulder at me. The lethal edge vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by absolute, unyielding devotion. "Do not look away, Tina," he instructed softly, turning his attention back to the trembling man on the floor. "You need to understand exactly what happens to anyone who dares to threaten my queen." The heavy, metallic scent of violence from the study was quickly replaced by the sterile smell of rubbing alcohol. Less than an hour after Desmond was dragged out of the penthouse, a private medical team had converted the guest wing into a pristine clinic. I lay back on the crisp white examination table, The soft cotton of Sang-do's oversized shirt pushed up to my ribs. The lead physician, an older man who kept his eyes respectfully fixed on his equipment, squeezed a line of cold ultrasound gel onto my lower stomach. I shivered involuntarily. Instantly, a large, warm hand enveloped mine. Sang-do stood right beside the table. He had changed out of his ruined navy dress shirt, now wearing a simple, dark gray cashmere sweater that somehow made his broad shoulders look even more intimidating. His grip on my fingers was a grounding anchor, his thumb brushing a slow, protective circle over my knuckles. "Is there a problem?" Sang-do demanded. The low, authoritative vibration of his voice made the physician freeze. "No, sir," the doctor replied quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the wand. "Just locating the fetal pole." "Ah, there." He pressed a button on the console. A rapid, rhythmic thudding filled the quiet room. It sounded like a tiny, frantic drumbeat echoing through the speakers. A sudden, fierce ache tightened my throat. Hot tears spilled over my eyelashes before I could stop them. For the past 6 weeks, this pregnancy had been a terrifying secret, a dangerous vulnerability that forced me to wipe my identity and flee. But hearing it, hearing the undeniable, fighting proof of life inside me, shattered every defensive wall I had left. I looked up at Sang-do, the ruthless syndicate king, the man who had ordered an execution on the tarmac without blinking, was entirely paralyzed. His dark, calculating eyes were locked onto the monochrome screen, tracking the tiny, fluttering pulse. The sheer intensity on his face wasn't cold or dominant. It was absolute, raw reverence. He slowly released my hand, reaching out to trace his long fingers gently over the edge of the monitor. "That is my blood," he whispered. The sound barely carried over the frantic rhythm of the heartbeat. He turned to me, the lethal edge in his gaze melting into something entirely devastating. He leaned down, bracing his forearms on either side of my shoulders, and pressed a deep, lingering kiss to my forehead. His lips were incredibly warm against my skin. "You gave me an empire today, Tina," he murmured, his breath fanning across my cheek. He shifted, his large, calloused palm settling with staggering gentleness over my gel-covered stomach, claiming us both. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never want to run from it again." For the first time since the airport lockdown, I didn't want to fight him. I closed my eyes, letting the steady, beautiful rhythm of the monitor and the heavy, protective weight of his hand lull me into a perfect, quiet peace. The quiet of the clinic vanished as soon as the doctor packed his equipment and bowed out. Sang-do lingered for a moment, his hand resting warmly on my knee, before his secure phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, his jaw instantly tightening into a hard, unforgiving line. "I need to take this in the study," he murmured, his thumb brushing over my skin one last time. "Rest." The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the sprawling guest wing. I pulled the oversized shirt down, my mind still spinning from the sound of that tiny heartbeat. A soft knock broke the silence. One of the senior house staff, a woman named Ji-woo who had served the estate for years, wheeled in a polished silver cart. "A soothing herbal blend, miss," she said, her voice unusually tight. She poured the steaming amber liquid into a porcelain cup and offered it to me. I reached out, my fingers gripping the saucer. A sharp, chemical scent cut through the delicate aroma of chamomile. It smelled faintly of crushed almonds. My survival instincts, sharpened by years of navigating Desmond's toxic world, instantly flared. I looked up at Jiwoo. A thin bead of sweat was trailing down her pale neck, and her hands were trembling so violently the cup rattled against the saucer. "Who paid you?" I asked quietly, refusing to lift the drink to my lips. Her eyes widened in absolute terror. Before she could answer, a deafening, mechanical screech echoed through the ventilation shafts. The luxurious penthouse lights flickered and died, instantly replaced by the violent, throbbing pulse of emergency red strobes. Jiwoo dropped the porcelain cup. It shattered against the marble floor, the toxic liquid sizzling slightly as it burned into the expensive rug. She didn't reach for a towel. She reached into the pocket of her pristine white apron and pulled out a suppressed handgun. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, aiming the barrel directly at my chest. "They have my son." I threw myself off the examination table just as a bullet tore through the crisp white paper where I had been sitting a fraction of a second ago. I hit the hard tile, my bandaged ankle screaming in protest. I scrambled behind a heavy steel medical cabinet. The penthouse was a fortress, but Baek Ho-jin hadn't tried to break through the reinforced glass or the army of guards downstairs. He had bought the people already inside. Another shot shattered the mirror above the sink, showering the floor in glass. "Jiwoo, put it down!" I shouted, searching the sterile floor for anything I could use as a weapon. The heavy double doors of the clinic suddenly burst open. Jiwoo shrieked, dropping her weapon in sheer terror as the bodies of Sang-do's 2 elite hallway guards were thrown violently into the room, followed by 3 heavily armed men wearing the rival cartel's insignia. The impenetrable fortress had just been breached. The 3 rival mercenaries barely had time to raise their weapons before a lethal shadow tore through the shattered clinic doors. Sang-do hit them with the sheer, devastating force of a freight train, snapping the leader's wrist and dragging me into the hallway before the bodies even hit the floor. Minutes later, the agonizing groan of the massive steel vault door sealing shut severed us completely from the war zone above. We were miles beneath the city grid, locked inside a reinforced concrete bunker designed to withstand an apocalypse. No cellular signal, no heavily armed security detail, just the 2 of us, and a suffocating, heavy silence. Sang-do dropped his empty weapon onto a steel utility table. The deafening clatter echoed off the bare walls. His dark cashmere sweater was torn at the left shoulder, revealing a jagged, bleeding graze cutting straight through his dark tattoos. He didn't even acknowledge the wound. He simply turned his intense, calculating gaze directly onto me. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, closing the distance between us in 2 long strides. "I'm fine," I breathed, my spine hitting the cold concrete wall. The sheer exhaustion finally eclipsed my adrenaline. My legs simply gave out, and I slid down until I hit the dusty floor. He didn't pull me up. Instead, the ruthless syndicate king dropped to his knees right there on the hard concrete beside me. His large, warm hands gently framed my face, his thumbs brushing frantically over my cheekbones, searching my eyes for any hidden injuries. "They were inside the penthouse," I whispered, the horrifying reality of the betrayal finally settling deep into my bones. "Jiwoo, she was going to kill me, Sang-do." "I know," he murmured. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration that commanded the tiny room. "Ho-jin bought my staff. He thought he could buy my fortress. But he doesn't realize that my empire isn't made of glass and marble, Tina." He leaned closer, his forehead resting heavily against mine. The intoxicating scent of smoked cedar and gunpowder completely surrounded me, replacing the sterile air of the bunker. "You are my empire," he confessed fiercely, the lethal, cold edge in his voice melting into pure, desperate devotion. As long as you are breathing, I have everything I need. I reached up, my trembling fingers brushing against the torn fabric of his sweater. I carefully traced the warm, raised ink of his tattoo right next to the bleeding graze. He drew in a sharp breath, not from pain, but from the sudden, intimate contact. For 6 months, I had fought this man, convinced he only saw me as a debt to be collected. But sitting in the freezing dust of an underground bunker, surrounded by the absolute isolation of the Ghost Protocol, the final defensive wall inside me completely shattered. I didn't pull away. I tangled my fingers deeply into his dark hair, pulling him flush against my chest. A deep, rumbling groan vibrated in his throat. He wrapped his massive arms around my waist, lifting me effortlessly into his lap. His mouth crashed down on mine, hungry and uncompromising, washing away the terror of the night and claiming every fractured piece of my heart. The insulated silence of the bunker was the safest I had felt in 6 months. Wrapped in the lingering heat of Sang-do's arms, the brutal reality of the syndicate war felt miles away. He rested his chin against the crown of my head, his breathing finally slowing to a steady, grounding rhythm. Then, the dormant bank of surveillance monitors covering the far wall violently flickered to life. The sudden, blinding glare washed the concrete room in a harsh, pale blue light. The bunker was supposed to be completely severed from the outside network, but the main screen bypassed the security protocols, filling with a distorted, high-definition video feed. Sang-do's entire body went rigid. He didn't scramble to his feet. He rose with a slow, terrifying precision, placing me gently behind his broad shoulders as he stepped toward the glowing monitors. The static cleared. A man with a sharp, scarred face and a flawlessly tailored crimson suit stared back through the camera lens. Baek Ho-jin. He wasn't in some remote warehouse. He was sitting, perfectly relaxed, behind the shattered glass desk of Sang-do's own penthouse study. Lined up on their knees in the background were the surviving members of the estate staff, blindfolded and trembling, surrounded by heavily armed mercenaries. "A fortress is only as strong as the people who clean it, Sang-do," Ho-jin sneered, his voice bleeding through the bunker's speakers with arrogant venom. "You vanished. Very dramatic. But an empire requires a king to sit on the throne, not hide in the dirt." Ho-jin casually picked up the silver letter opener Sang-do had used earlier, pointing it toward the kneeling hostages. "You have exactly 1 hour," the rival boss declared, the amusement dropping completely from his dark eyes. "Sign over the southern shipping ports and the casino districts. If you do not broadcast your surrender before the hour is up, I will start executing your loyal subjects one by one. And then, I will tear this city down to its foundation, until I find the woman carrying your heir." The feed abruptly cut to black. A suffocating quiet pressed into the cramped concrete space. I stared at the blank monitor, my hands shaking. Ho-jin wasn't just threatening territory. He was holding innocent lives hostage simply to drag us out of the dark. Sang-do didn't yell. He didn't shatter the screen in a fit of rage. That absolute, chilling stillness returned to his imposing frame. He reached down to the steel table, his long fingers wrapping around the barrel of his empty rifle. His jaw was locked so tightly, a muscle feathered beneath his bruised skin. "I have to go back up," he stated, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum that promised absolute carnage. "You can't," I pleaded, stepping forward and gripping the torn sleeve of his cashmere sweater. "It's an ambush, Sang-do. They have an army waiting for you." He turned, his dark eyes completely devoid of any mercy. "Then they will die." I refused to let his arm go. He was a king preparing for a slaughter. But walking into a fortified ambush wasn't a strategy. It was a death sentence. "You can't shoot your way out of a hostage situation when they have the high ground," I said, my voice steadying as I dragged him backward toward the glowing surveillance console. "I am not going to negotiate with a dead man," he growled, the raw violence in his tone vibrating through the small room. "You don't have to," I countered, sliding into the heavy steel chair in front of the bypass terminal. "He didn't just hack your security feed to gloat, Sang-do. He left a digital footprint. He opened a two-way connection." My fingers flew across the heavy mechanical keyboard. 6 months of working as a forensic accountant to pay off Desmond's gambling markers meant I knew exactly how syndicate money moved. Hojin was arrogant. He had routed his little broadcast directly through his primary shell corporation's server to ensure the signal wouldn't be traced by the authorities. Sang-do stepped up right behind me. He didn't interrupt. The blistering heat of his chest pressed firmly against the back of my chair, his large hands gripping the metal headrest as he watched lines of encrypted code reflect in his dark eyes. "Mercenaries don't fight out of loyalty," I murmured, tearing through the flimsy secondary firewall of Hojin's offshore holding bank. "They fight for wire transfers. If the money dries up, the army walks away." "You are inside his treasury?" Sang-do asked, the cold fury in his voice shifting into something dangerously close to awe. "I am emptying his treasury," I corrected. I hit the execute key. The pale blue screen flashed a brilliant, blinding green. $3 billion distributed across 12 international accounts vanished in a fraction of a second, locked securely behind a decaying encryption key that only I possessed. I leaned forward and tapped the flashing microphone icon, broadcasting my voice directly back into the penthouse study above us. "Baek Ho-jin!" I spoke clearly as my keystrokes forced the study's security camera back to life. "Check your Cayman accounts. Your balance is 0. You can't even afford to pay the men holding the guns behind you." On the monitor, Hojin snatched a secure phone from his tailored crimson jacket. His arrogant sneer instantly dissolved into sheer, unadulterated panic. The heavily armed mercenaries standing behind him immediately lowered their weapons, exchanging confused, angry glances. Their payroll had just evaporated. The loyalty Hojin had bought was already turning into a mutiny. I stood up from the console, turning to face Sang-do. The lethal, cold fury that had consumed him moments ago was completely gone. His dark eyes swept over me, blazing with a staggering, hungry reverence. He didn't just look at me like the mother of his child anymore. He looked at me like a weapon he had severely underestimated. "You just bought me a bloodless victory," he whispered, a dark, wicked smile finally breaking across his sharp face. His wicked smile barely lasted a second. The bypassed surveillance monitor violently flickered again. Hojin wasn't panicking anymore. He looked like a cornered, starving animal. His flawless crimson jacket was discarded, his tie ripped off. He dragged a violently bruised man into the frame, shoving the barrel of a pistol directly against the man's temple. I gasped. It was Sang-do's lead lieutenant, the man who had driven us off the runway. "You think bankrupting me changes anything?" Hojin spat, his voice cracking with unhinged desperation. "It just means I have absolutely nothing left to lose. The money is gone, so the new price is her. Bring me the woman who locked my treasury in 20 minutes, or I paint this study with your lieutenant's blood. And then I execute the rest." The screen went permanently black. Sang-do didn't hesitate. The dark awe in his eyes hardened back into absolute, terrifying ice. He turned away from me, striding toward the heavy steel weapons rack at the back of the bunker. "Lock the terminal," he commanded, his broad back to me as he slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle. Do not open the vault door until I return. Sang-do, no, I pleaded, my voice trembling as I stood up from the console. He's desperate. He has an army of unpaid men who know they are dead anyway. You are walking into a suicide mission. He turned around, his face a flawless mask of lethal authority. I am walking into a reckoning. No one holds my people hostage. He crossed the room, pressing his palm to the biometric scanner. The massive steel vault door groaned open. He didn't look back. If he had, he would have seen the horrifying realization settling over me. He wasn't going to survive a desperate cartel with nothing to lose. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, the electronic lock engaging with a final, echoing thud. I sat in the suffocating silence of the bunker for exactly 60 seconds. My hands shook as I looked at the glowing green terminal. I was the only person on Earth who held the decryption key to Ho-jin's $3 billion. I wasn't just a target anymore. I was the ransom. I pulled up the bunker's security override. 6 months of surviving in the underground had taught me exactly how to bypass a biometric lock. The mechanical keyboard clattered under my frantic fingers as I ripped the physical encryption drive from the console port, clutching the cold silver metal tightly. A sharp beep echoed through the room. The heavy vault door hissed, sliding open to reveal the dark, dusty corridor leading up to the surface. I stepped out of the safest place on Earth, my bare feet hitting the freezing concrete. I was terrified, but I absolutely refused to let the father of my child die for me. The grueling climb up the emergency stairwell tore at my lungs, but I didn't stop until I reached the top floor. The air in the destroyed penthouse study was thick with the heavy, copper scent of blood. I stepped through the ruined oak doors, my bare feet silently crossing the debris-littered floor. Baek Ho-jin's head snapped toward me, his arrogant sneer faltering as I held up a small, silver flash drive. "Let the lieutenant go," I demanded, keeping my voice surprisingly steady despite the dozen rifles suddenly trained on my chest. "I am the only human alive who can unlock your $3 billion. You shoot him, I destroy this drive, and your own mutinous army will tear you apart for the bounty." Ho-jin laughed, a desperate, grating sound that echoed off the cracked marble walls. He shoved the bleeding lieutenant aside and opened his mouth to order his men forward, but the command never left his throat. The floor-to-ceiling reinforced windows of the study didn't just break. They exploded inward in a catastrophic shower of glass. The deafening roar of a heavy tactical helicopter hovered just outside the shattered frame, its blinding searchlight flooding the dark room. But it wasn't the aircraft that completely paralyzed Ho-jin's men. It was the man stepping through the jagged ruins of the window. Sang-do didn't look like a syndicate king anymore. He looked like the Grim Reaper. He moved faster than my eyes could track, and he didn't bother with a single word of negotiation. The heavy rifle in his hands roared, dropping Ho-jin's elite guards before they could even disengage their safeties. The sheer, ruthless violence was absolute. He crossed the sprawling study in seconds, an unstoppable force of nature wrapped in a torn cashmere sweater, slaughtering the opposition with terrifying, fluid precision. Ho-jin panicked. The rival boss raised his pistol toward me, his hands shaking violently, but Sang-do was already there. His large, calloused hand clamped fiercely around Ho-jin's throat. Sang-do lifted the rival boss completely off his feet, slamming him so brutally against the marble wall that the stone violently fractured behind him. Ho-jin gasped for air, his heavy weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. The surviving mercenaries instantly dropped their rifles, falling to their knees in absolute terror as Sang-do's elite backup flooded the room behind him. The war was over in less than 60 seconds, but Sang-do ignored the surrendered army. He ignored the bleeding rival king choking in his grip. His massive chest heaved, the coiling dragon tattoos visible through his torn sweater flexing with lethal adrenaline. His dark, furious eyes snapped directly to me, sweeping over my shivering frame to ensure I was completely unharmed before settling into a stare of unyielding, terrifying possession. Sang-do released his grip. That Kojin crumpled to the fractured marble floor, gasping and entirely defeated. The surviving mercenaries were already being dragged out by Sang-do's elite guard, but the syndicate king didn't spare them a single glance. His chest heaved, the torn cashmere sweater exposing the intricate, dark ink across his broad shoulder. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. The lethal, unrestrained violence that had just leveled the room vanished the second his large hands settled firmly onto my shoulders. "You bypassed a biometric lockdown," he rasped. His voice was a raw, heavy vibration, torn equally between absolute fury and staggering relief. "I had to," I whispered, reaching up to rest my palms flat against his solid chest. The frantic, pounding rhythm of his heart beat wildly against my fingertips. "I told you, Sang-do. I was the only one who had the decryption key, and I absolutely refused to let the father of my child die in a rigged ambush." The last defensive wall between us finally crumbled. The fiercely independent ghost who had boarded a plane to London no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who fully understood the terrifying weight of the empire she had just saved. Choi Sang-do didn't pull me into a frantic embrace. Instead, the man who had just brought a rival cartel to its knees, the undisputed ruler of the city's underground, dropped slowly to his own knees, right in the center of the ruined study. He ignored the shattered glass and the debris biting into the floor. He wrapped his massive arms securely around my waist, pulling me flush against him, and pressed his face to my stomach. The intense heat of his skin bled right through the thin cotton of my oversized shirt. "You didn't just save my life, Tina," he murmured, his breath warm against the fabric. He tilted his head back, looking up at me with dark eyes burning with unyielding, absolute devotion. "You claimed it. My syndicate, my wealth, my blood. It all belongs to you." I didn't step back. I didn't try to run. Sweeping his heavy boot across the ruined floor, he carefully cleared a safe patch of shattered glass so I could step into his space unharmed. I stepped closer, my fingers tangling deep into his messy, wind-blown hair. I looked around the destroyed penthouse at the loyal, heavily armed guards who now bowed their heads toward us in absolute, reverent silence. "Then get up, Sang-do," I answered softly, a genuine, powerful smile touching my lips as I stroked the sharp line of his jaw. "A king shouldn't kneel in his own ruins. We have an empire to rebuild." He let out a low, dark chuckle, the sound vibrating straight through my bones. He stood up with flawless grace, effortlessly sweeping me into his arms to carry his queen out of the shadows.